We now want to summarise that history into a theoretical construct. And we're going to do that by looking at what the foundations of economic systems are. And we want to develop a system of understanding, a theoretical framework that we can apply equally to communists, to capitalists, to the ancients, to the Greeks, to the Romans, late and early, and so on. And we're going to do that by looking first of all at the general question of economics. Economics is an important issue for humans because economics is all about the social mechanics of commerce. It's how we meet our material needs through social means, by specialisation of labour and by exchange. And so we can see that economics itself is a useful and important thing which goes very close to the heart of what it is to be human. We can't live without a certain amount of material support, and the most effective way of doing that is socially. And so it's a lot better if we have some people being farmers and other people being teachers and somebody else being a dentist. It's very hard to fix your own teeth. But when we look at economics, it is grounded on commerce, on the social mechanics of commerce. What that means is it's on the social mechanics of exchange, of the marketplace, of some form of interchange of material things. I might work building something, you might work building something else, and we then exchange our excesses. I might be a shoemaker, you might be a farmer, I might have more shoes than I need to wear, you might have more food than you need to eat, and so by swapping, we're both able to benefit from each other's expertise. Now, lurking behind this matter of exchange is the simple concept that I must own the things that I'm going to exchange in order to justly to be able to transact with you. And so economics always needs a system of property titles or property rights. And this is why the communists were so big on focusing on property when they were really seeking some sort of fair deal for the average worker. The importance of property title can't be overstressed, and if you read the economic theorists, the major economic theorists, you'll find that just about every major economist has at the basis of his theory a theory of property. We've seen it with Adam Smith. Karl Marx gave us a theory of economics and in fact gave us the name capitalism and capitalist. And we find that with just about everyone else. Milton Friedman, a recent economist, in his work grounds his economics on his theory of property. And so what we can say is that if we have an economic theory or an economic system in our society, we must have a system of property rights and property titles that system of economics rests on. When we look at the question of property, and especially going back to what we found from Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, is that property title systems are only ever systems of convention. They are socially determined. They are always couched in what the local community, as the government and system of laws and customs, is willing to support. And so underneath our property title system is always the legal and government system supporting it. Because as we've seen, the government system gives us our laws and tells us what things are permitted and what things are going to be penalised. The government gives us our social sanctions, and the law is simply a systematic embodiment of social sanctions. So we can say that economics rests on property title, rests on our legal governmental system. However, our government system, our system of laws and government, isn't the absolute bottom or the end of our thinking, because there's considerable debate as to what a good law is, what a bad one is, what is a good system of government. Should we have a monarchy or a democracy or some other form of government? And we've got this idea somewhere behind there that there are good and bad laws and good and bad governments. How do we decide what is a better or a worse law, or a better or a worse system of government? To that we need to look at our understanding of culture and ethics. Culture gives us that whole complex context of the way that a society chooses to live its social and private life. Ethics are those system of principles of appropriate relations between persons. And so it's really to ethics that we look to see whether a particular law is good or not. It's in ethics that we plumb the question of what is just, what justice means, questions of what people should do with each other or should not do with each other. These are all ethical issues. And while there are different cultures and different traditions, we find a considerable convergence when it comes down to fundamental ethical issues. For instance, while there might be different cultural practices, say with the differences in eating habits or the cultural preferences when it comes to meeting people, or whether particular men should speak to or be allowed to speak to particular women and so on, may be cultural, and they may change quite radically. When we move to ethical issues, we find that it's very, very different. There has never been any culture that has survived for any length of time that believes that it's acceptable for people to kill each other without any particular provocation, say in war or in self-defence. We call that murder. And while there may be different ways that we express our appreciation of a good meal, there aren't any cultures that celebrate murder or maybe lying or other forms of violence or theft or what have you as ethically acceptable. And so what we can say about ethics is that while it's easy to confuse ethical values with cultural values, when we get down to essential ethical issues, there is a very high degree of consistency. Now, having said that, we also have to note that there are high consistency in terms of ethics between sets of cultures, sets of civilizations. And so to look at, say, Rome and say, what was the ethical system in Rome? Well, the difficult thing there is that there were actually two of them. The first ethical system that we associate with early Rome had to do with things like patriotism, honesty, and integrity. The ethics of late Rome tended to be largely that strength is good. And if you are a strong person, you are a good person. And the aim of public life was to exercise strength. Now that change from aiming to be a good person to aiming to be a strong person made the difference between Rome growing as a civilization and an empire to falling off the side as a failed civilization by about the 6th century. And we find a similar thing with Greece. Early Greek ethics tended to be in common with early Roman ethics. And so we can say, yes, there are some ethical systems that you do find in some cultures that are very different to others. However, we can group them together and say some ethical systems are conducive to a civilization surviving and thriving through time, and other ethical systems tend to be associated with civilizations at an advanced part of decline. And the whole question of ethics is something which has attracted the mind of man for many years. The ancient Greek thinkers, Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates, came to the fore because they existed at a period in Greek history when this change of ethics was hard on the Greek people. Socrates, the first of these three, grew up in an environment that valued hard work, integrity, solidarity. And he could see largely that by the time he was an older man, the young Greeks were being brought up into something very, very different, something far more self-indulgent, a completely different ethical system. And so Socrates had the task of working out what it was that was good about the previous system, and in fact, why it had some form of intellectual integrity. Plato took Socrates' teaching and stylized it and reformed it into a systematic philosophy. And so we tend to still study Plato. Plato has the distinction of giving us an ethical system that has intellectual integrity. It's not simply a set of ideas that happen to be popular or happen to be broadly accepted. They are the observations that come from dwelling on what it was that made the Greek culture strong and have integrity and understand the meaning of justice, as opposed to those replacement pseudo-values that had dominated the Greek mind in the time of Socrates and Plato and was largely responsible for the erosion of the culture. And we find Aristotle, who was Plato's student, took Plato's insights and refined them even further. And so we have this history of ethical deliberation that goes back to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle to tell us that ethics is in fact different to culture. And while ethical systems do change, the essence of what is sound ethics, in other words, what really does help the individual and the community to flourish, do not change. It's rather a matter of when ethics change that you see the result is not simply a new society, but rather a society that is beginning to commit a form of cultural suicide. However, to really plumb the question of ethics, we have to dig down a little bit deeper. What is it that culture and ethics are intended to achieve? We've mentioned earlier that ethics is that study of the system of principles for appropriate relations between persons. Formally speaking, that definition is the definition of a moral. A moral is a principle for the appropriate relations between persons, and an ethic, strictly speaking, is a set or a code of moral principles. And so when we talk about professional ethics, what we mean is that there is a professional ethic for property economists, which is specific to that profession. There is a similar but distinct ethic which is for medical professionals, because medical professionals have different ethical questions that they have to confront. But what is it that makes an ethic good, effective, robust? What is it that enables you to say that this ethical system is better than that ethical system? Well, if we look at ethics, we find that the whole purpose of it is to give us guidance into how to treat other people. And what this means is that we have to understand what other people are in order to be able to understand what a good ethic is. For instance, if I think a cow is of similar moral importance to a human being, then my ethic is going to be quite something different. On the other hand, we've already seen that one of the flaws in the tribal outlook on the community is that the community only really extends as far as the bloodlines go, the clan boundaries, the family boundaries. And in some cases, there are absolutely hideous things that are permitted to take place between members of the tribe and people who are outside the tribe. Cannibalism is probably the most evident example of treating other human beings in a very subhuman way. It's largely because it's built on an ethic which says that humanity, or at least human dignity, stops at the boundary of the tribe or the clan. The study of what it means to be human, or even the theory that we carry of what it is to be human, is called anthropology. And we have the science of anthropology, and within that science we have a number of different positions, and each position is in itself an anthropology, a theory of what it is to be human. And what we can say is that one's ethics rest on our understanding, our theory, if you like, of what it is to be human. So an ethical system is tested by the quality or the theory, the understanding that we have of what it is to be a human person. And so if I believe that it's only people with skin the same colour as mine who are truly human, or I might believe that people of a different gender or something are not quite sort of the full quid, I will have a completely different ethic if I assign human dignity to all people, regardless of their gender, their race, and so on. And we see an attempt to do this in the public domain today. And so our anthropological theory, our theory of what it is to be human, or what human nature consists of, is what gives us guidance to guide how our ethics and our culture go. That in turn lead to our legal governmental system, and therefore our property rights, and therefore economics. And so they become like a pyramid of foundations, one upon the top. When we look at anthropology, though, we find that our theory of what it is to be human isn't foundational. It isn't the beginning of our understanding. We always have some reason, some story, some belief that tells us how to define what it is to be human. And again, we can look at extremes where in Nazi Germany the full respect of human nature was only given to a relatively small number of people. Certain Christians, Jews, people who had mental defects were all considered to be in some way subhuman and therefore able to be dealt with in a very cruel and inhuman way. But where do we get this idea of what it is to be human from? Well, we've already seen that Indigenous people get that from their understanding of where humanity comes from, their creation event, their origin. And we'll see in looking at modernity the same thing. The ancient Hebrews saw their understanding of humanity, what it was to be a Hebrew or a Gentile, came as a result of their creation story, their spirituality. We also find that in the Christian tradition, the Islamic tradition, and in fact just about every culture. And we also find it in modernity, even though modernity, strictly speaking, now sees itself as intellectually secular. And we'll be exploring this shortly. So what we have now is a hierarchy of sciences, where economics as a science rests on our property title system, which rests on our understanding of government and politics, our political science. That rests on culture and ethics, on moral philosophy. That rests on anthropology. And below them all sits metaphysics, our understanding of the very beginnings, the very fundamental aspects of existence. For most people, their metaphysical theory is their spiritual theory of the creation of the world, or what have you. In other people, their explanation for existence can come from a scientific explanation, such as the Big Bang. In all cases, this very foundational question of how existence came to be there, one way or another informs all of our culture, even to the unlikely extent of informing our economic principles and institutions. Let's now look at the application of this theory to the Western situation, Western culture, Western economics. If we begin at the bottom, we can say, what is the Genesis story? What is the explanation for existence in the West? Well, the explanation is the Big Bang of the universe. It is the origination of everything that we can see from an explosion in some primeval era, where there's simply an expanding spray of atoms that went out through the universe. And as a result of the random collision of those atoms, the various things, the atoms, the gases, the planets and stars, all were formed. And eventually, through the process of evolution, we had the planets, life, and everything that we can see with our scientific method all came to be. And what this means is that our theory of existence comes from the Big Bang, from the idea that all that is simply the random collision of atoms, individual energy, all working away totally independently. Now, within this system, it's easy to see why we find it difficult talking to Indigenous people when they talk about their spirituality, because the Big Bang has got nothing to do with spirituality. And so we're able to create an entire culture and the institutions that serve that culture all on the basis of the random collision of atoms and that individual energy leading to the evolution which brings us here today. If we use the Big Bang theory to explain existence and the origin of everything, then our understanding of human nature follows quite logically from it. Humans are the result of evolution, the random interaction and collision of individual atoms and so on, working against entropy, to be able to look after themselves ultimately, because it's the individual who will bump into others and one way or another form relationships eventually guided by the overall goal of the best benefit outcome for the individual. And so the anthropology we get is a material, self-interested, rational individual. Now each one of those words is important. Material means that spirituality is irrelevant to our culture. Self-interest means that humans are the sort of creatures that at the very, very base of the question are motivated by things that serve themselves, that in one way or another make them happier, more pleasured, whatever, richer, comfortable, whatnot. And we look around and we can say, well, we like to say that we're rational. Although some of the actions of some public figures occasionally makes you wonder. But that's the definition that we have. And you'll find, those of you who remember doing your economics, that this anthropology, this theory of human nature, is curiously similar to what we learn about as Homo economicus, the economic man that is at the very base of our economic theory. You may recall that economic man is a rational, self-interested individual. And because we're operating in the economy, it means that all his rationality is applied to the self-interest revolving around material well-being. From this theory of the human person, what kind of a culture and what set of ethics do we come up with? Well, obviously, if we're evolved from a random collision of individual atoms with their individual energy wanting to realise itself, freedom becomes the greatest good, the optimum. And so liberalism in one of its various guises becomes very important. And so one of our greatest goals is to be free, to like those free atoms. The way we work out how to ration liberality, freedom between people, is by utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the ethical theory that was developed by Jeremy Bentham and then perfected by John Stuart Mill in the middle of the 19th century. And it would hold that at the end, the only things which are important are the things that make us feel good, maximise our positive pleasures, and minimise our sense of discomfort, our sense of physical discomfort. And as long as we will the greatest good, in other words, the greatest pleasure, for the greatest number, then we have the optimum ethical outcome. That is utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number, expressed in material terms. So the liberalist utilitarianism gives us an ethic, a fundamental principle for appropriate relations between persons. Now it's curious because this materialist ethic actually gives rise to two apparently different forms of government. On the left, we have liberalist utilitarianism expressing itself as socialism. And there, the rational self-interested individuals realise that there are others who are more powerful than they, who need to be controlled by the forces of the state. And so the liberal utilitarian, leaning to the left of politics, would argue for a system of government where government is very strong and private initiative is minimised. And that way the liberal utilitarian is able to ensure that they have the greatest level of freedom for themselves because they don't have economic tyrants working over them. However, a liberalist utilitarian can also take a different route and conclude that because they want freedom, they want the freedom of the market and the freedom to be able to express themselves and realise their own benefit, and the freedom to be able to collide with others and have a test of energy, which we will call competition, in the marketplace with an absolute minimum of government interference, and we'll call that capitalism. And so we find that out of this same ethic, we have two fairly radical different government systems, different systems of law and government. One would give us freedom by having a strong state, and the other one would give us freedom by giving us a strong market. The liberal socialist would argue that all property should be held by the state, or at least all productive property. And so that comes up into a system of property rights that we would know as communism. State capitalism is another name for it. It's a system where all of the productive property is held by one big monopoly called the party. It doesn't work very well. On the right, the liberal utilitarian who expresses himself as a capitalist and say, no thanks, I would like the free market because I want to be free, to be able to use my individual energy competitively to see how well I can come out of my random collision with others, will argue for absolute private property. And that would say that all property should be held individually with an absolute minimum of government interference. And in fact, expressed in an extreme form, they would say that the only job of government is to ensure absolute private property rights for the marketplace. Ultimately, these two approaches lead to two different ways of controlling commerce. On the left, we have state control, where things like the quantity and price of things being brought to the market are strictly controlled by the government, by the state. So we have statism, or state control. And on the right, we have market control, where it's assumed that because of the need of people in the marketplace being evident to potential suppliers, they will go out and work out ways of supplying it to the market. And historically, we find that the approach on the right tends to have been able to solve people's material needs considerably better than the system on the left. So there we have it. The foundations of Western economics have given us actually two diametrically opposed endpoints sitting on one starting point. That's curious. Let's move now and look at the Indigenous people with our next slide. When we look at Indigenous communities, we find that regardless of where we find them, they always have this resonance when we look at their Genesis theory, their theory of where the world came from. It comes as a result of mythic spiritual events. And these mythic spiritual events, in some ways, communicated not just the material of the world, but they also communicated an understanding of what humans were supposed to do, both with their property and with each other. And there's this sense of connection, this radical connection, which is universal across Indigenous people. And so the Genesis story is always spiritual, and it usually connects with the idea that humans are both body and soul. They're both material and spiritual. And it would say that there's the spiritual dimension of the human person which makes them unique and distinct from other creatures. When we move to seeing how that turns into an anthropology, we find this unique spiritual creator who in most cases has some kind of personal relationship, at least with the first humans, and personally handed down the laws and customs and the land itself and all of the creatures in it to the tribe, on condition that they follow the customs, which in all cases mean living like a giant family, connected, solid, respecting and helping each other. Not so much helping in the active sense, but certainly supporting materially. You find that the anthropology is in terms of connectedness, and especially with this spiritual dimension added. And so spirituality is important because it helps you to remember who you are, and that is that you're a part of a tribe, and this emphasis on being a part of something. You're connected to something. You exist and have your nature because of your connection to something else, something bigger and more permanent than you are. From this anthropology, we find that the culture and ethics is always variations on the theme of serve and you will be served, you will be completed, your needs will be met. Somehow you will be happiest, you'll be proudest when you are a part of a tribe which in some way you have supported, and the more actively you support it, the more proud you can be of your humanity. And so your humanity is completed through service and connectedness. And this enables us to understand why Indigenous people do see their role as being far more connected to their tribal brothers and sisters than Western people understand, because to a certain extent, that's how they rate themselves. In the West, we think of ourselves as successful if we become wealthy. In Indigenous community, you are successful if you have found a way of being of great service to the other members of your tribe. From this cultural and ethical perspective, we come to the system of law and government. What we find in Indigenous systems is that law and government tends to be very local. It is always operated usually at the lowest level possible. The technical name for when something is done at the lowest level possible is subsidiarity. And so we find this subsidiarity practiced within Indigenous communities. And what this means is that most of law and order comes from the family. And we see this in the way that a tribe is humiliated if any member of their tribe acts inappropriately. And so this means that if I was to go and mug somebody, I would not have to be so much afraid of the police if I was an Indigenous person, as I would be afraid of my own family. Because my family, through their humiliation and their identification with me, would seek to correct my behaviour. And so there's no need for a police force. And so we have this strong family and clan government and a good sense of inner control. The laws and governmental systems, customs, tend to go back through the ethics and so on, back to the spirituality and traditional customs. And so we have this stronger sense of connectedness back from the legal system back to the Genesis theory. From this clan-based government system and traditional set of laws, we have a property system which is also intimately connected with the clan. And so the positive evidence of a communal approach to property isn't something which is simply an arbitrary decision of the tribal group. We can see that it actually sits quite logically as growing out of these lower and deeper issues, how they see their humanity and where they see the world coming from. And of course, last of all, we have the economics. How is it that material things are exchanged usefully across the society? The economic system. In Indigenous people, usually there is a high degree of labour and wealth sharing, and a low polarisation of wealth. While an Indigenous community might be very proud to have a wealthy chief or a wealthy king, the level of wealth polarisation between the average villager and their chief or their king is a considerably narrower margin than what you might find between a junior worker and the CEO of even a medium-sized organisation in the West today. The level of income polarisation and wealth polarisation is literally microscopic by comparison, even though it appears to them to be something quite great. But there's another difference in the way that wealth and income polarisation differs between Indigenous communities and Western communities. Largely, there is a certain amount of antipathy, of discomfort, when one becomes aware of what the CEO of the NRMA or Coca-Cola Corporation or some other public organisation is earning every year. There is a sense that they're earning too much, and there is a certain amount of greed and envy that is likely to be floating around in the West. However, for Indigenous people, having a wealthy and affluent chief is actually a source of tribal pride. And it's because the chief is there as a symbolic leader and actually a representative of the very fabric of the tribe. And through solidarity, having a wealthy chief is a reflection on the fine performance of the tribe as a whole, and so one can take pride in it themselves. These are ideas that are fairly alien to the Western mind. Let's now put these different observations about the different historical approaches all onto one page and see what we come up with. What we can see is when we combine the modern West with the communal Indigenous communities, we see pretty much all of the possibilities that are available. We can see that in the modern West, with its materialist explanation of the origin of the universe, quite consistently that bubbles up through the material self-interested rational individual to either communism or socialism, or on the other hand, capitalism. We find that the approach that we find in this expression of how a culture and its institutions develops is also shared with late Greece and late Rome. But otherwise it's relatively unique in the history of human community. If we move to looking at the indigenous communities today, we find an expression of community that starts on a shared understanding of mythic events that form the world, that bubble up through these various intermediate institutional levels, right up to the level of an economics, which is extremely social. Social, that is, and not socialist. It is built on a notion of social solidarity with hard work and a degree of private ownership, but it's always ownership circumscribed by the needs of the community. We find that this alternate approach is shared with other ancient cultures, such as the ancient Greeks, the early Romans, the ancient Germans, the ancient Hebrews, and the pre-modern or Christian West, as well as contemporary customary communities. There may be other possibilities and other Genesis stories that lead to particular economics. However, in general, they seem to be able to be formed into one of these three possibilities. An alternative way of understanding this more universal approach to understanding the human condition and how it leads into economic outcomes is to look at what I'm going to call the dimensions of human action. Generally, the Western mind is comfortable with the idea of a single dimension of possibilities for human action. And largely, this operates between the political left, which would lead to state control, and the political right, which leads to self-control or market control. And these come up as the systems of socialism and capitalism. If we look at these in terms of how well they've fared historically, what we can see is that capitalism is very good at creating high incentives. And because of those high incentives and the individual striving towards competition and success, we have high productivity. We also find that capitalism is extremely good at responding to change. And so we can say also that capitalism is extremely flexible. However, critics of capitalism have noted that when capitalism is given its free rein, you also find that it tends to lead to extraordinary polarisation of wealth and incomes. And necessarily this means that there is a high level of pauperisation associated with capitalism. It's easy to say that all of those people who are poor deserved it because they don't work hard enough, because all they have to do is look at the successful capitalists to see what was possible. However, the reality is a little more complicated than that, because not infrequently the poor majority are really what has been working very, very hard to make the very small number of winners what they are. Another attribute of capitalism that its critics point to is the fact that capitalism leads to an attitude which wants the minimisation of government, in fact the minimisation of social ordering altogether. This comes by the rather unpleasant name of anarchy. And so we find that capitalism, while it has many, many great advantages, also is subject to these rather unfortunate downsides as well, especially the polarisation of wealth and the leading to large numbers of impoverished people as a result of it. When we go to socialism, we find that socialism overcomes this alienation of capitalism by being very inclusive, and it's egalitarian to the extent that there is a hopefully low level of wealth polarisation. Socialists also find socialism quite attractive because, by and large, associated with the economic theories of the socialists, also tend to be theories and values associated with family life that make socialists more likely to be extremely promiscuous. We find, for instance, that in the communist era in Russia, They were leading the world in abortion and a number of other unfortunate outcomes as a result of a very promiscuous lifestyle. When we look closely at the socialists, however, we find that they too are without their critics. Unfortunately, socialism tends to frustrate incentive, and so while it might be egalitarian, there tends to be an equal sharing of poverty amongst the socialists, to the extent that many socialist communities tend to be almost at the brink of starvation very often. A curiosity of socialism, finally, is that socialism comes ultimately from an attitude that wants to throw off existing law and order. And so it's fundamentally also leading towards anarchy. And so we find that one of the curiosities of the material individualist approach that we've seen as giving rise to the Western mindset is that in both expressions, capitalism and socialism, they both expect a high level of control to force people to behave, while individually both socialists and capitalists are really positively disposed to anarchy, to a lack of law and order. However, these two possibilities, with their advantages and shortcomings, don't express the full spectrum of human possibilities for society. And so this is very difficult for the modern Western mind to grasp, because the modern Western mind, as we've seen, has already counted out the possibilities that are outside of this one-dimensional range of political and economic possibilities. We're going to call this one-dimensional the left-right dimension of political alignment and economic thought as the institutional dimension, because we're looking at what kind of economic institutions, of systems and conventions we're going to use in our society. We're going to say that's only one dimension of human action. There are others. Now, we've already seen that a key difference between Western people and Indigenous people is their understanding of what it is to be human, this notion of connectedness, connected ultimately from their Genesis story. But this difference in understanding of what it is to be human, we will call an anthropological dimension. And if we look at the anthropology that underlies both the left and the right, that of the material, self-interested, rational individual, we can say that this material individualist gives rise to either the socialist who equally shares his poverty and the capitalist who has the high incentives for a small number of people to grow fabulously wealthy while everyone else is in dire poverty. There's only one possibility. At the other polar extreme of the anthropological dimension is the solidarist, the person who believes that human nature is something which is universal to all humans, people should be treated equally, but moreover they should care for each other in some way. This sounds quaint and primitive to the Western mind. However, as we've seen, it's been shared by most of the rising cultures of history, as well as today's Indigenous people. We're going to call this a solidarist pole. Solidarist comes from the word solidarity, in other words, to stick together. And this notion of sticking together is what humans should do. Is very, very important for Indigenous communities. And we do find that the Indigenous and ancient communities had the great advantage that their cultures were very supportive. Curiously, they were also highly leisured. Studies today of Indigenous people have shown that the typical Indigenous person, regardless of where they live in the world, tend to complete all of their chores, their work, their labour for the day in about 4 hours a day. And they spend the rest of the time relaxing and telling stories and musing on their spirituality and so on, basically enjoying themselves. We find that in the West, with all of our labour-saving devices and advances and efficiency and all the rest of it, the average Western household tends to work 8 or 10 hours at work and then comes home, cooks dinner, and perhaps on the weekend mows the grass and does all the chores. We find that we stop working about sort of 5 minutes after we fall asleep at night. We're not particularly leisured. Whereas the ancients and the Indigenous people tend to have this very, very relaxed lifestyle. Another curiosity of the ancients and the indigenous people is that in themselves they're very efficient. When they work, the products of their work tends to be very effectively turned into a standard of living. And so we find that there's not a great deal of waste. There's a great deal of trust in Indigenous communities. You don't need lots of laws and controls and administration and management. And so you find that people are left to sort their own problems out, to answer their own questions, and largely to organise themselves. And we've seen that as far as law and order and the way it's administered primarily at the family level. And so you don't have to have a large police force in an Indigenous community, whereas that's a waste of resources that we find in both the communist and capitalist West. There are a number of downsides with Indigenous communities, however. The first is that Indigenous communities tend to be what we're going to call early satisficing. And what that means is that after they've done enough work for the day, they're very happy to put their feet up and relax and not go any further. This often means that Indigenous communities are happy to be able to do things the way that they've always done them, in some case supported by their traditions and customs. And as a result, their overall standard of living may not be everything that it could be, or in some cases their rate of technological and scientific development, again, isn't everything it could be. And the reason is they're happy enough once their belly is full and they've got a roof over their head to sit down and just enjoy themselves for the rest of the day. Whereas we tend to work all day and at the end of it come home and pull out the books, and maybe you might be doing distance education, for instance, in your spare time, what little spare time you have. An Indigenous person wouldn't value that terribly highly. A closely related downside with Indigenous communities is overall a disinterest in science. This is largely because they've got such a strong understanding of the way the world works because of their Genesis story, their spirituality and so on, that they don't need to learn any more and do very much science. And so this disinterest in science also tends to hold them back. A third problem that you tend to find amongst Indigenous solidarist communities is cultural homogeneity. Remember, especially at the tribal level, that evidenced itself in the rather unfortunate tendency to treat people outside the tribe rather poorly. And this means that when you have small solidarist communities, they tend to only be able to operate in small groups. And so we see this in some cases in developing countries, say New Guinea, where you have a large number of different tribal groups all trying to come together to form a modern nation state, and finding that it's very, very difficult because their respect for each other only goes as far as their own tribe, as much as they're trying very, very hard to see through that. We find that the innovations of the world religions, especially Christianity and Islam, have been largely able to overcome this narrow tribal perspective that we find with Indigenous and ancient tribes. However, we find that by and large, to the extent that they are still following a tribal spirituality, that kind of universality is very difficult. The third dimension that we can add in follows from what we can see in the Indigenous communities in terms of their emphasis on the importance of the spiritual dimension to their life. Again, it's the dimension that is largely opaque to the modern mind. And so as well as adding an anthropological dimension, we can also add a third spiritual dimension, which comes from our appreciation of whether the spiritual realm has any significant part to play in our understanding of the world around us. If we look at the spiritual dimension, we find that we can see at least three possibilities, and certainly three possibilities that have evidence in history. Largely we've been talking in terms of Indigenous people in terms of a positive deity, a positive spiritual experience or an understanding of a creator spirit that has done good things for the community, has given them their land and their laws and a sense of bounty and comfort, order and justice and so on. There are two other possibilities, however. In some cases, we find negative deities among some communities. Generally, these communities have not been able to stand the test of time, but in some cases, they have formed quite significant civilizations and empires. And I'm thinking here especially of the Aztecs. A negative deity is one where the spiritual entity is expressed in negative terms, and rather than by helping and civilizing a community, it keeps a community in fear. And so we find that's often associated with institutions such as human sacrifice and so on. In between these two possibilities, there is a third spiritual possibility, and that is the possibility that's chosen by the modern West. And that is to simply reject spirituality outright as totally irrelevant. And so we find this third, which we'll call an atheist possibility, one where if a spirit world exists, it exists unrelated to the world around us, and so it's simply irrelevant for any of our public discourse. And that's largely what we found in countries such as the United States and Australia. Let's look at the possibilities that these dimensions have in terms of the way that they order our society. Well, now I'll look at these three dimensions to look at the possibilities that come by applying these three dimensions. First of all, we'll look at the spiritual or metaphysical dimension, which is where we get our story of origins from. We've seen that that gives rise to a personal anthropology, an understanding of what it is to be human or what human nature is. That in turn leads to attitudes regarding other people, our ethics and culture. And from those, we find that they generate our public institutions, things like our culture, our government, our law, ultimately our property, and our rules of commerce. When we apply this model, we've seen at the spiritual dimension, there are three possibilities. We can have either a positive deity, we can have the atheist who is able to say that spirituality is simply irrelevant if it exists at all. And so it means that our understanding of the world comes down to how we understand the world ourselves. We don't have to go outside to others. And so we can say in the middle position there, the top of the tree as far as evolution and everything else goes is the self, or the atheist position. And we also have the negative deity as the third possibility of the spiritual dimension. The spiritual dimension then leads on to our attitudes about how to treat other people. Our exploration of the Indigenous people has seen the way that under a positive deity, people are led to believe that people are made by God and need to relate to him. And from that comes the relationship to others, which encourages things like respect, honesty, and charity. This is not to say that these particular qualities are absolutely unique to people who have a positive deity behind their culture, but simply that the positive deity tends to be associated with encouraging these virtues to a larger extent than others. If we move to the atheist position, where it's understood that every man is an individual, in other words, every person is there for himself, his own benefit, we find this creates an environment where the emphasis is on individualism and material benefit. If all there is in existence is the individual pitted against other individuals, then obviously the objective of human life is to have the most pleasant human life possible, and that is only done by attracting to oneself the maximum level of material benefits. And in this environment, we find that while honesty pays, we also notice that in many societies, quite rationally, so does dishonesty. When we move to the negative deity, we find that under that world view, we see that the spiritual figure, the creator, the all-powerful one, is there as an oppressor, as a source of fear. This leads to an attitude between humans that the other in relationship, is there as an object for exploitation. And so we find historically with negative deities, they give rise to human sacrifice and fear as the dynamics for society. We can now look at the type of public institutions that come from these three positions. The institutions of communal property and some sense of shared solidaristic approach to society we've seen as the legacy of the positive deity that we've found in early Greece and early Rome and the other cultures that had a positive deity behind them, say in Islam and Christianity. When we look at the secular approach of the atheist or the individualist approach, it gives rise to cultures such as capitalism, socialism, and late Rome. While the negative deity, where the other is for exploitation, has been evidenced in the ancient Phoenicians of Carthage, the Aztecs, and the Indian Thuggees, all of which are now lost in history, because largely they're cultures that are not really able to survive and thrive, because they rely on a very negative dynamic for social control. Hopefully now, by looking at these possibilities for human action and then applying them to property, we can see that the question of customary property is considerably more complex than simply trying to work out a valuation answer or a compensation answer for the extinguishment of a customary rights claim. To some extent, the question comes down to the question of whether human society is something that should operate at the level of a community operating in solidarity, in which we understand the connectedness of persons and try as far as we can to discourage that disconnectedness that comes by using property as an antisocial tool for the exclusion of others. And so we see that these two fundamental views of property are really quite extremely different. We'll now move on and look at how perhaps we might be able to bring some kind of a reconciliation between the Indigenous view and the Indigenous tradition, the Indigenous culture, and the Anglo-Australian view of land and property. What we've seen is that in Anglo-Australian land law, the private rights to land come from the Crown property, and they tend to be expressed negatively in terms of exclusive rights, exclusive possession. The Anglo-Australian approach emphasises the material side of the benefits of relating to land. And so this exclusive allocation of rights, which is really a way of preventing other people from benefiting from them, is absolutely core to Australian land law. And because we're focusing on exclusion, and to a certain extent leading up to a polarisation of wealth between those who own property rights and those that don't, we rely rather heavily on the coercive power of the government to enforce the property rights, because they're certainly not something which is supported by those people that don't have them. The recognition of customary owners has added an extra layer and certainly an extra level of complexity to this rather simple relationship. Formally, the customary owners exist before and above the Anglo-Australian government as the prior owners of the land before the government was able to take it. And so whatever land hasn't been alienated from the Crown through titles such as freehold is now recognised as at least potentially available to be reclaimed by its customary owners. And ultimately we have a hierarchy where the customary owner's land has been taken by the Anglo-Australian government and then granted to private owners in the Western system. And so this question of first owner of the land for the Anglo-Australian government has been challenged by the existence or the recognition of existence of the customary owners. And what is currently the case is that the Anglo-Australian government is understood to have only taken what is known as radical title to the land when it took possession on Possession Island. Radical title can be translated to mean potential title. It's the title that comes when the customary owners lose their title. It's like the Anglo-Australian government was sitting there as the next in line for the property rights once the customary owners let it go. But there's a lot of land that the customary owners have not let go and are now seeking recognition for. And so this act of recognition by the Anglo-Australian current law and government is a considerable step forward. And so we now have two sources of recognition, if you like, coming from the Anglo-Australian government. And that is the granting of land down to the Western occupants, but also the recognition of prior ownership and the compensation for extinguishment when that has happened, at least after recognition. However, this leaves the customary owners in an odd situation. While they have the oldest and most prior rights to land, within the confines of Anglo-Australian law at present, customary owners are not able to transfer their interests within customary sensitive ways down to Western occupants. They are not permitted to sell or lease it. Now, we've seen that customary owners are not particularly interested in selling their property. In fact, they'll fight tooth and nail not to sell it. However, in many cases, they're more than willing to lease the land and otherwise make it available to Western occupants. This is because exclusive possession is not a part of the customary tradition. However, there's no currently existing mechanism within Anglo-Australian government for this renting or this leasing of the customary property to Western occupants, tenants, who might otherwise be very interested in putting it to productive use. Viewed in this way, it's quite evident that the unblocking of customary land can simply be done by creating the appropriate legal mechanism for the regulation of the leasing of customary land to Western occupants. This is already done in different ways in many different countries, especially across the Pacific and through Africa, where the Indigenous owners have more political authority. It's a matter of setting up the appropriate institutions within Anglo-Australian government to recognise the customary owners' prior rights to land and also develop institutional arrangements for being able to transfer particular material rights to Western occupants. Now, the transfer of these rights would have to be only temporary, which is pretty much what you find with a lease. And so the transferable interests that customary owners need to be able to make available to Western tenants would need to be defined and limited, both in space but also in time. But this is what we do with a lease in the West. It's also important that it is limited to material rights, and so the terms of the lease would need to specify those land uses which were permissible. However, once these packages of rights which customary owners would be willing to transfer or to lease to private owners was recognised, it would be a very simple matter to develop an appropriate transfer or title register, something similar to the Torrens title system that exists at present for Western property interests. But we also find that there are other asset registers and property registers that are now coming into existence. Especially the Federal Personal Property Register is a good example. The Personal Property Register can list various personal assets, in other words, not real estate assets, that are subject to transfer and claims of interest, especially for making sure that where they're being used for collateral is not sort of follow the asset when they're sold. It's very important if you buy a motor car to be able to check easily to make sure that the person you're buying it from still doesn't have it under some hire purchase agreement. And you can do that by checking the personal property register. And this creation of a system of registers is a fairly straightforward thing for Anglo-Australian government. There's already plenty of precedent. When we look then at the valuation issues that come from customary owners leasing directly to Western tenants, we find the problem of customary rights tends to dissolve. because here the valuable rights that are being transferred are purely in terms that the Western valuer can enumerate. And so it simplifies considerably the valuation issues. In this way, overall, the development of a leasing institution for customary property will be the easiest and most effective way to resolve once and for all the problem of the valuation of the customary interest. A closely related matter to the question of being able to make customary land available to Western tenants is the matter of land use control, and this is also an area where Indigenous customary owners have very strong views, especially when they see their land taken from them and used in ways which they consider to be violations of their traditions in some way. The question of land use control is considerably simplified when the customary owners are the landlords who are directly leasing their land to Western tenants, because the very terms of the lease can easily embody what the Indigenous owners are willing to alienate to their Western tenants. And so this means that the question of land use control is considerably simplified. It means that Western tenants would be in a similar situation to that Western tenants are in when they rent their land from anybody else. If you lease a property from a landlord, you are subject to the restrictions which are explicitly set out in the lease. And this would be the case with Western tenants occupying customary land or leasing customary land. And in addition to that, like any other Western occupant, Western tenants of customary land would be subject to the Anglo-Australian environmental planning legislation and limitations. And so there would be the second level of control or area of control. And what this means is that the Western tenants would be subject to the land use control set in the terms of their lease, which comes down from the customary owners, and also to the planning restrictions and regulations coming in the usual way from the Anglo-Australian government. Having gone through the possibilities of the issues to do with leasing of customary owned land to Western tenants, we can then move to the final part of the puzzle, and that is the possibility of leasing customary owned land to the government rather than simply surrendering it and having their customary rights extinguished. When we look at what the government seeks to use land for, such as providing infrastructure or other public purposes such as schools and hospitals and so on, we find that in all cases they require control of land. However, while these infrastructure elements may have very long life expectancies and perhaps are intended to be there indefinitely, they can be considered to be temporal, in that we might build a school, but at some point in the future the school may not be needed. We may need a hospital or a road or even a water supply system. But again, while these may perdure permanently into the future, it's not totally necessary. It's also not necessary for the government to have permanent and perpetual rights to the land. They merely need to have rights to the land that in some ways are conformed to the needs of the specific infrastructure. This opens up the possibility of leasing to the state. Again, what this means is that from the customary owner's point of view, they're able to make the land available for government use without extinguishing their customary connection, which we've seen earlier is absolutely vital to their understanding of themselves. When we move to looking at the question of valuation, in this particular case, we find that it's a little more complex. When customary owners are leasing to Western tenants who intend using the land for economically efficient purposes, the setting of the rent is something which is quite straightforward in Western valuation terms. When it comes to leasing land to the government, so that the government can provide public services and infrastructure, the question of rental value becomes a bit more complex, and that is because of the externalities created by the infrastructure. In compensation law, we find that there is an element of offset in many jurisdictions for the externality, the benefit that comes from the public purpose of the resumption. And here the purpose works almost in reverse. When the customary owners make available to the Anglo-Australian government, let's say, some land to build a school on, that school is going to considerably aid the local community and benefit the customary owners. And for this reason, this benefit effect is a powerful offset to the value of the land which would otherwise be appropriate. And we can find this logic can be applied to roads and water supply and all of the others as well. And so while, say, an irrigation scheme, such as a dam to open up an area for irrigated agriculture, might potentially involve millions of dollars and appear to be a very valuable and unique piece of property, for the Indigenous owners to ask for the market rent for that would be highly inappropriate, because the customary owners are more likely to benefit because of the positive effect that's going to have on the surrounding land. And assuming that the customary owners also own the surrounding property, then that becomes a major offset that might entirely negate the rent applicable. From the government's perspective, the immediate benefit of leasing land, perhaps perpetually in some cases, or at least with some provision for permanent ongoing rights in the case of, say, roads which are intended to stay there for a very long time. The impact on the government is that it avoids the problem of extinguishment and all of the valuation problems that have come as a result of working on the extinguishment approach. It does replace the extinguishment with compensation for an annual payment obligation. Now, while this might appear to be more problematic in the long term, we've already seen that because it can be offset by the benefits that the public purpose results in, it could be more likely that the land leases in many cases would be more likely be at a peppercorn rate. And so from the government's point of view, well, it removes the problem of extinguishment with all of its valuation problems. It also means that in many cases, but not all of them, the annual payment would be relatively minor. And while it may be perceived as less secure, it still is possible for the Anglo government, as long as the purpose for which the land is taken is realised on an ongoing basis, that this lack of apparent security can be overcome by other mechanisms. Finally, from the government's perspective, while it may not be the arrangement that they are familiar with historically, it's not unknown to government. And in fact, we're finding that the Australian government is relying more and more on renting the premises that it uses for a large number of activities. We certainly see that widespread in government office space, where they're operating largely in rented space in recent decades. We also find that for government purposes, where they need access to land, say in foreign embassies and so on, it's not uncommon for these to be done through leasehold arrangements as well. The point here is that government's leasing land has considerable precedent, as well as having considerable conceptual advantages. What we've got to, therefore, is that by taking a very detailed look at the nature of the relationship between human societies and their land, we're able to develop a far more detailed understanding of the problem of the intersection between customary property and white Australian community and law. We're also able to see that the problem of customary valuation or customary land rights and extinguishment and so on is largely illusory. And unfortunately, the problem exists today because of an unfortunate omission in Australian property law That's not to say Australian real property law, but more generally simply the fact that Australian law at present doesn't permit the Indigenous owners of customary rights to be able to treat their property in the same way that someone with, say, personal property is able to treat it, because of this unfortunate coincidence that the property of the Indigenous owners happens to be real property in an environment that is still unduly influenced by the feudal and Enlightenment prior theories and institutions of property, which are largely no longer appropriate for the Australian context.